So hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second Zoom version of the Maverick Diversity Institute. So just to get started, a bit of an introduction of myself. My name is Alex J. Lucier. I'm a master's candidate in the Counseling and Student Personnel program, specifically College Student Affairs. And I also work as the graduate assistant for American Indian Affairs. I was previously a teaching assistant in American Indigenous Studies, among other things. Before kind of getting into the real content of the talk, just wanted to put up a quick definition about what is a first generation student. Well, it turns out actually coming up with a definition is a little bit more of a quagmire, I guess, than simple. There's a few different ways we could define it. The state of Minnesota defines it as having no parents that attended college, whether that means folks from dual parent households, both parents didn't go, or single parent households where the one parent didn't even attend college, even for a semester or a class. The National Center for Education Statistics is very similar, being the first in the family to attend college. The federal definition / the Pell Institute definition talks about having no parents or guardians actually attain a bachelor's degree. So that means where a parent or parents or guardians have attended or received a AA or associate's training of some sort, their children would still be considered being first generation because of the difference between 2-year and 4-year institutions. And then TRIO, very specifically, the language says all parents do not have a bachelor's degree. So that is more inclusive of like folks coming from double or single parent households. Something to kind of keep in mind / consider while thinking of the definitions: what happens if a student is technically first generation, but their older sibling went to college? They may have more information, experiences to fall back on, and ideas of what college should look like than maybe someone who's the first in the very first in the family. And then different institutions have different experiences. Like, for example, if an older sibling went to the University of Minnesota and the second student went to MSU Mankato, the differences are going to be kind of more stark, even because of the two different systems, although things like filling out FAFSA and stuff may be more easy to explore. Thinking next, having a quick brainstorm session. So I want people to get into chat however they want to express what are some issues that come along with trying to actually definitively define, I wanted to use that verbiage, definitively define the experience of a first generation college student. So what might be an issue with even trying to define something? Megan Sinclair Usher says including some while excluding others. Yes, very common for any definition. Like if you were to say, what is a woman? Does that mean every single woman experiences the same thing going to college?
I think like all definitions are kind of tricky. Like, for example, the idea of determining what is essential in the like in our world right now, like, oh, I need something, I have a need, or I have something that's essential. Everybody has a different opinion of what essential or non-essential means, and I think that applies to just across the board, all definitions. What does it mean to be first generation? Who do you define as a parent? I mean, I think that can vary just as we are all individuals. That varies for our students as well. So
yeah, totally. I have no issue with anything you just said. Thank you for sharing. Tomorrow also adds, not having a parent attend college does not mean they can't be successful. Some may just need more support than others. Very true. Yeah, you don't want to put someone in a box, but at the same time, it is also kind of important because all first generation students don't have the same experiences, but there are some common barriers that do affect the first generation college student experience overall. And so what are some of the barriers we might actually foresee first generation students running into? This can be along the lines of, in general, what types of barriers? Hey, Tamara.
Hello. I see that Sarah said not understanding how the system works. Somebody said financial. I think those, like, very much so, thinking about just, I mean, I'm not a first generation student, but I am the first student in my family to get a master's. And I think that is what has helped me understand what it is like for first generation students to some extent, just because there are things that I have no idea about. And I didn't even realize as a student that I went to my dad for all of those questions I had, because he was someone in my life who went to college and got a degree and got a job and figured out how all of that worked. And so just thinking about the fact that some students don't have someone in their life who has gone to college means that they don't have that person to rely on for even the little things like, hey, I hate my roommate, because I work in residential life right now. So when people have like roommate concerns and things, the amount of students I talk to who don't even know they can do things like change their room, or find a more affordable housing option, things like that, really surprises me. I also think students believe that they have to live on campus, and that is not the case at this specific institution. At some schools it is. And explaining that when I was working with admissions, a lot of people didn't understand that there were options and that different schools had different requirements and things like that.
Yeah, it's very true. Thank you for sharing. Going back to what Sarah and Brad both said in the chat, Brad said financial. Financial aspect can include things like not knowing how to fill out the FAFSA, not knowing, for example, if you're the first in the family to leave the house, how do you pay rent? How do you find an apartment to live in? Do you have to live on campus? A lot of things that require a lot of consideration that more information might be more helpful. But because, like Sarah said, people don't understand how the system works, with the very big caveat that it's not that the student lacks something that they don't know, it's because they just haven't been told. That all factors into that. So kind of keeping these in mind, moving forward, the rest of the talk isn't going to be focusing so much on like those specific barriers, but I want to keep them in mind because we're going to be focusing more on like the identity aspect of first generation college students, but keeping in mind that these barriers exist and factor into those. So why this topic? Why did I choose to talk about this? In student affairs as a whole, it's an often overlooked category for students, an overlooked way that students are marginalized or minoritized. It's easier to look at things like racial identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, because they're more physical to see, and we don't really acknowledge someone's experience with college or familial experience with college as much as maybe those other categories. But it's important to think about because the population of first generation students nationwide is increasing. More students whose parents never attended college are getting more resources or finding the benefits of getting a college degree. It's talked about in like the national conversation around student affairs right now, because as financial recessions in the nation tend to get worse, more people tend to enroll in college because maybe the job they had doesn't work anymore, so they want to have more opportunities to career, or people not making enough money and wanting to find an opportunity to be able to get a better paycheck to support their families and stuff like that. So we're going to be having more first generation college students moving forward, and it would be a great disservice to just ignore that. That first generation status, while it's called first generation student, it actually lasts throughout someone's lifetime because they were the first and will never not be the first, which means it has very far-reaching consequences. All aspects of the university experience are affected by it because everything can be a brand new experience. It affects the job search because if your family, I'll say for my own, my mom and my grandparents worked in service industries. And so when I'm looking for a job now as someone who's about to get a master's degree, the types of advice they give me are like, oh, just send out a resume to every opportunity you can, or call wherever you apply, call them until they give you an answer. Well, in higher education, you can't really do that, and you'll probably get people angry if you were to do that. So that's not to say that they're giving me the wrong advice, but they're just following what they've been told, which might not apply to my situation. And so with that career attainment, it can have negative effects because not having that information that would be more applicable to that situation. For myself, it's a personal topic because I am a first generation student. I come from a single parent household, but multi-generational. Neither my grandparents nor my mom attended any classes, any sort of college type stuff. So part of that is why I applied to doctoral programs and everything like that. If I'm going to be the first, I'm going to go as far as possible because I've been able to internalize the message of I belong here. But that doesn't mean that my experience is applicable to anyone else. But what kind of got me started thinking about this, I've told this story before. When I was taking a human development in the family life cycle class as a part of the CSP program, as part of it, we had talked about in one of our discussion posts the milestones that someone in a family reaches that mean the different areas of moving up to different age categories. For example, in some families, the mark of a teenagehood, there's the concept of like the quinceañera, of once you hit age 15, you have a way to tell the community, hey, I've reached this age, hey, I'm now an adult or a teenager, however you want. With the mixing of different like bicultural identities, it can mean what it is for each family. And that's the emphasis, that it's different for each family and culture. And so I was thinking back during this class, well, traditionally, the way that not only for my parent and my grandparents, but going back even to my grandma's family, my grandpa's family, the ways that someone marks becoming an adult are having a child, getting the life career. Sometimes it was graduating high school, but that's not really the same milestone as it used to be. Getting married, moving out of the house. Those types of things are considered when someone becomes an adult. Well, for myself, I was like, well, I'm not married. I don't have a career. I don't have a car. I live in an apartment. I don't have my own home. Am I actually adult yet? If I'm operating in what my family had considered traditional, how am I navigating being an adult? Like, how does college, becoming a college student, fit into that? So once I had taken this class, I had this conversation, I really started to think about it. And you can see in the picture here, I'm wearing the Maverick First sticker because of the efforts that have been going on MSU's campus to help be more inclusive of and aware of first generation college students at MSU. That was one of the conversations that came up. It's rethinking and reframing, what does college mean to my identity? A little bit of the boring part to go with it. In the class, we talked about Erikson's stage of psychosocial development. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into vast detail about this theory or anything like that. But for college students, we fit into first entering college students fit into the stage 5 of the identity versus role confusion stage, basically meaning that's when people tend to search for their sense of self, develop their personal identity, redefining the role in the family and society, which is kind of the emphasis here. The society part being, how does a college student fit in versus like someone who, for example, becomes a firefighter or works in a retail or grocery store. They tend to fulfill a role in society, while a college student is almost like put on the side of like, you'll fulfill your role in society after you graduate, is like the focus of that. And then that questioning of, well, who am I? What can I be? High school students, pretty notorious for trying to figure out their identity. I know at one point in high school, I, like looking back now, why? Like, it was just trying to navigate that, who am I? What will make me stand out? So there is, at least Erikson back then has been thinking about that type of stuff. But when we're talking about specifically that family aspect for first generation college students, there's this concept of what's called family achievement guilt, talked about by Covarrubias and Freiberg back in 2015. Family achievement guilt comes from experiencing a discrepancy between the opportunities a student gets versus what their family members who aren't college students or college educated may experience. So that's like, well, why am I out here in Mankato getting a college degree while my family's back in St. Paul working retail jobs, like struggling, having adverse life experiences and things like that? A common thought with that. An interesting fact with that also is the guilt tends to be stronger when thinking about the discrepancy between family and the student's opportunities than the student may think about non-family members who are in the same boat. So if you're from the same cultural background, you're less likely to feel guilty about moving ahead than if it was with your family. It is reported in higher incidence with minoritized households. We'll commonly hear about like what's called the college voice of like, you go home for a holiday and your family's like, well, why are you talking like that? Why do you sound like that? That's your college voice. Oh, you're so educated. Here comes the educated person. And Longwell Grice, I'll talk about the lack of practical familial support. That's not to say that the family can't support the student, but don't really know how. For those questions of like, how do I fill out the FAFSA? Well, if someone never went to college, how are they supposed to know that? If a student is struggling with homework. So sometimes the family can actually feel a sense of resentment of like, why are you going to college, spending money, getting loans while you could be back home paying rent or helping out around the house, especially if one of the family members has a terminal or lifetime illness. It can have those far-reaching effects. So with that, another brainstorm session real quick. How might you be able to tell that a student is experiencing that family achievement guilt? So if you were meeting with a student, especially if you do advising of any sort, or if you work in security and a student's under a crisis of some sort, what ways might you think that that might express itself? Not to go clinical, but like, what are the symptoms you might see is kind of the vein of this. Hey, Baku.
Hey, well, I can just speak of like examples where students will come in and share with me that they want to change their major because they're not doing well in courses, but their parents are having this career path for them and they're doing this major for their parents. So that's an example that I'm thinking of just in terms of the family achievement guilt and doing it for your family because it's a collective, it will be seen as a collective achievement instead of just your own personal, your own passion, your own career path that you want to have for yourself. I think largely in first generation students beyond cultures, but I would also say like in a lot of cultures that focus on the collectivism piece too.
We're going into a little of what the next couple of slides are about. So Good point. Yes, especially when if you're considering the reasons why someone goes to college. Like a lot of first generation students aren't going to college just to like become like to get that college experience of like going to going into Greek life or partying every weekend. Like they tend to be there for that education piece in order to benefit their family in the long run, going into that collectivism kind of aspect for certain cultural identities. Thank you. Tamara says the uncertainty of if they should be in school. Yeah. So if you hear a student like, I don't know if I should be here or I should just go home, why am I here? That can definitely be a way of that family achievement guilt being expressed. Megan says reluctance or fear of sharing college experiences, both good and bad with family/support system. That hits home, especially I got my undergrad in anthropology. So when I would go home for Christmas or whatever, people are asking, well, what do you do? Well, I'm studying anthropology. What is that? And then I have to go into the whole spiel of, well, it's the study of humans. There's 5 different branches, et cetera, et cetera. And then once I graduated with that, it was like, cool. What do you do with that degree? There's not a way to make that connection of like, well, why is that an achievement of some sort? Cool, you got a degree in something that isn't like a doctor or a teacher or something, like things that people can really conceptualize super easily. And then that bad part, well, I'm having a really hard time in this one class. How do I share that with my family when they're dealing with like maybe there's not enough financial support coming in? Very much a reluctance would be something you could see. Thank you. Another question for anyone who's here attending, have you ever experienced family achievement guilt? What triggered it and what was it like?
I can share a little bit because I think a lot of what you're talking about resonates with me. I too am a first generation college student coming from a single parent household. We have a lot of similar background history here, Alex. So yeah, I also remember it feeling like just a fish out of water often, like not knowing what I was doing and trying to figure it out on my own without the support of my mom. But then when I would go home and we would have conversations about things when I was in college, definitely there was this sense of like just almost being ashamed of trying to like achieve this goal when it was something that my mom didn't have that opportunity to also like share with. Like it just became like a disconnect between her and I because of that difference. And so like one of the conversations that stood out the most to me is we had a whole conversation about religion and beliefs, and the comment she made was like, well, that college education is, you know, really impacting your spirituality and your faith. And I was kind of just like, that's a comment that hasn't ever gone away, because I remember that conversation about how it was almost a negative thing that I was, you know, opening my mind and thinking about other things beyond my worldview that I had been raised in. And so, yeah, definitely that was like a moment of like shame and guilt. So that's just kind of my little story.
I've had a conversation too with my mom of like, where she was like, well, I don't really know what you're doing, but I do support you, whatever it is. But like,
yep, had those too.
I don't, it's like, I love what you're doing. Go rah, rah, rah. You're
yeah,
gonna
yeah,
do great.
like good for
But
you.
yeah, I'm not going to be able to help you with homework or anything of that sort, help you with the job search process. So
right.
I also had that same conversation with my cousin about religion. And he was like, oh, you know, Delia, do you continue to go to church and whatever? And I was like, well, not so much anymore. And he's pretty philosophical, but he was like, oh, you know, that's what college does to people. And I was like, I don't know, you know. But yeah, definitely there's a kind of the track who goes to college and the track who doesn't a little bit in my family. Mm-hmm. Being a first generation in my immediate family.
Yeah, I think it's also important to consider with that cultural aspect as well, not just religion, but in culture in general, if education is seen as a negative thing, especially for like Native American folks where education has like a really negative history, or if you come from a really religious household where you're learning not religious things, no matter what faith you are, that can just add to more of that, like, do I even fit in? Why am I doing this if my family doesn't support me? A lot of those questions can come up. So actually I had another question on here, but I think we'll save that to the end because this next part I think is more relevant to this, what I just talked about. How do we see cultural norms and expectations shaping how this guilt presents itself? I think what Megan and Delia both just shared is really applicable to this. A little bit too of what Paku had said when we're talking about the collectivist cultures. While first generation isn't something we can see as like a racial category in that like sense of minoritization, it still has cultural implications. I mean, technically everything does, but so that was more of a brainstorm. The question is, what is the archetype of the ideal successful university student? When we're thinking about what university student or what universities are looking for in a student, what are the traits, what are the lifestyle choices that the ideal successful university student should have in the eyes of higher education in general, I guess. Paku says clear career goals like having a major decided, completing an undergrad in 4 years, yes. Being active in student life, student organizations, campus events, yes. Emily says a student who is involved both in the classroom and outside of the classroom. Tamara saying making money immediately after graduation. Yeah, we focus so much on that retention slash career attainment rate. Well, we have 100% placement rate in this program, this or that program. I'll add to what about for MSU Mankato? Some of this obviously applies, but what does the perfect ideal MSU student look like? Along with those, we think of like the Maverick spirit of like, even if you're the only one out there doing the right thing, that's okay, forge the path forward. And how often do we see students fitting that archetype perfectly? I would venture the guess, not that often. Not just in terms of first generation status, but a lot of oppressions just in general, when we're talking about critical race theory or anything of that sort, focus on an ideal or a perfect specimen, quote unquote, where we tend to base a lot of oppressions off of. So for example, when we're talking about homophobia, it's like contrasting it with like the perfect heterosexual individual. And so the farther you are away from that, the more oppressions tend to happen. Disability and ableism focus on folks who are the farthest away from the perfectly able person. A lot of these don't actually exist. There is no 100% male, heterosexual, abled, white. Like a lot of it is based off of these ideals that don't actually exist. And so thinking about that, why do we tend to hold on to these types of archetypes? Why are students facing barriers based off something that doesn't exist? So just kind of keeping that in mind while we move forward. Going into that cultural piece a little bit more, an article by Stevens et al. Talk about they switch between cultural matching theory, cultural mismatching, so that's why it's in the parentheses. So for this study that they did, they first talked to university administrators around the country to figure out like what are the norms, what does a good college student embody? And the number one most mentioned norm slash trait was independence. The traits that a model student holds tend to be what fit in most with like middle class individuals, folks who live on campus and spend a significant portion of their time during the week on campus. They don't work a second job. They spend all of their free time doing college related things. And then that aspect of independence. Well, the motives of first generation students tend to be different. They're relatively interdependent. Interdependent meaning they're doing it for their family, they're doing it for the culture, they're doing it to better something as a group rather than for themselves. So there's less of that idea of get a college degree so I can leave my family, get a house, find a spouse, and start my own family. There tends to be that I'm getting this so I can benefit others. First generation students tend to be more working class or hold working class ideals. You'll see more travel between back and forth from home. I know an American Indian student that I've worked with who has to go back home every weekend. Like they don't have that choice. One of my best friends, the reason I came to MSU actually was because I have two best friends. One went to UW River Falls, one went to Mankato. I liked purple more than whatever color UW was, and so I chose Mankato. Push comes to shove, voila, I'm here. But one of the things is I came here with that best friend who wound up dropping out after one semester because she had to go back home every weekend. Didn't have a choice to do that. They also tend to have more life circumstances outside of the classroom. So when you're looking at that, the university is set up to have this kind of ideal person, well, just based off of the aspects of what first generation students' life circumstances tend to fall. There is that mismatch between that. But there are very real consequences that come with that, especially with performance. Inequalities are set in place that lead to things like lower grades and graduation rates. That mismatch comes from that not fitting into that middle class culture of the university context, maybe uncertain about the proper way to act. I know for me, I'm been really afraid to do job interviews and stuff because, well, I don't own a suit. Apparently for a lot of interviews, you have to dress a certain way. Well, I never grew up learning that type of thing. My first job interview, I showed up in a plaid button-down shirt because that was the nicest shirt that I owned because I come from a lower income family. They may begin to even question, like, can I be successful here? Because what is inherent to my background doesn't fit in with the university, what they're expecting. One thing that specifically this article mentioned was finding ways to develop community can be very helpful, not necessarily just of like, well, we have homecoming, well, we have these traditions that always fit. So if you attend the traditions, you're going to fit in. But how do we develop community in a way that best serves all students rather than you should fit our archetypes? How do we better include more types of individuals? And even they mentioned the phrase like paving one's own way. How universities define that tend to focus more on that independent of like separating from your family, you're getting your degree so that way you can get a job for yourself, and instead redefining that to focus more on that independence. Paving your own way can mean finding more opportunities to benefit your family or benefit your upbringing, culture, etc. So the cultural mismatch can mean different things for students, leading to the performance consequences, that inequality, but it can actually lead to worse outcomes in the long run. Discrimination and microaggressions can be very prevalent when it comes to first generation students as well. While we tend to think of these things affecting, again, those other ways we conceptualize minoritized students, discrimination and microaggressions can show up for first generation students as well. The fact of the matter, CGS, that means continuing generation students, which is the contrast of a first generation student, someone whose parents did attend college, just have more opportunities because they have more people to talk to. Like Tamara had mentioned earlier, someone to ask questions to. There's more of an expectation of like, we know you can do it and I can help you because I've done it before. Where first generation college students, not only are they coming with no knowledge, they don't even know who to ask. They may not know where to get information. Like, if I can't do the FAFSA, who do I even talk to? So that lack of information leads to an inequity of services. The services we provide on campus, not just at MSU, but in general, students have to seek them out in order for us to be able to provide the best quality of service. That's a difficult concept to really grapple with, but the reality of the situation is, what can we do to better serve students who maybe don't know who to come talk to, maybe don't know who to ask? So just keeping in mind that we in higher education operate under that model. So thinking about how can we better or make more equitable the services that we provide to students, especially first generation. Microaggressions, the way that was defined is more of like the intentional or unintentional, like the little more communications that are kind of hostile, derogatory, maybe harmful, with like the slights and insults that may affect an individual or group. First generation students can experience these as well. They subtly demean and invalidate a person's identity, experiences, historical background. I can think of a story that was told to me from a professor that I had been working with, how when they attended their undergrad and grad in the same place, but for their doctorate went to moved to a whole new state. And their doctoral advisor was just like, well, you have to find an apartment here. And the person was like, well, I don't have the money right now to just like throw down in a deposit. And the professor was just like, oh, well, just ask your parents for it. This person, being a first generation college student, their parents didn't have $500 just to throw for a deposit that won't come back for at least another year. And so just how flippant that was of like, well, just ask your parents. Well, my parents, I'm here because I'm trying to get a better life for my family. You can't just expect because the students you work with or for yourself had those opportunities, those resources, doesn't mean that every student has that. And so these microaggressions can be internalized for the student to feel like they don't belong, maybe intellectually inferior, especially if someone comes from a lower income area where tutoring services may not have been as prevalent or available as areas with higher socioeconomic opportunities. Sometimes can feel like they can't be trusted. That can mean if, for example, an underclassman were to approach an upperclassman student with a question of like, well, how do I do this? They may like that upperclassman who's a first generation college student may be like, well, who am I to answer this question? How do I know I'm giving them the right answer? Maybe they should ask someone who has more experience. And these can be amplified for students who have other minoritized identities. These microaggressions can be unintentionally targeted toward different racial categories. For example, it can even be like assuming that someone who's a racial minority, assuming that they're first generation, or like, oh, you're representing your culture so proud by coming to college when your parents didn't. I had a friend who went to MSU whose one of their professors just assumed came from Minneapolis because they were African American, when yes, they're first generation, but that doesn't mean that they came from Minneapolis because of this preconceived notion. I don't know, it's really confusing. Plus, coming from Minneapolis isn't a negative thing. I don't know, it was very weird. But on the flip side, one way we can counter this, Ellis and others proposed what's called the MicroAffirmations. These can be both intentional or unintentional, different exchanges that convey the opposite of what microaggressions do, conveying inclusion, support, appreciation to individuals or groups who feel unwelcome or invisible in an environment, and kind of providing those academic and social experiences for students and to enable them to explore, develop, and affirm not only their racial, ethnic, socioeconomic identity, but also that sense of belonging. In student affairs, we talk a lot about Schlossberg's marginality and mattering theory. It undergirds a lot of what we do for student activities and stuff like that. And so a student who belongs tends to have better outcomes in the future going into it. So ways that we can convey that inclusion, support, and appreciation are super important. And so they break that down into 3 different categories of micro compliments. That's implying praise, admiration, or respect for an individual's identity or heritage. A lot of times folks are just, especially from who don't come from minoritized identity or don't have minoritized identities, may be afraid to talk about these types of things or downplay that someone's identity, heritage, upbringing can actually bring positives. So instead, it's giving compliments for the person to perceive as possessing something of high value with specifically their identity or their experience. So that can be complimenting in a way that shows what they bring is actually valuable rather than looking from always like a deficiency standard. So even working with first generation students, how I'm always emphasizing like first generation college students, we tend to be very good at using the search function on the website because we're always looking up questions for ourselves. So maybe first generation college students who work in student affairs might be the best people to ask because they found that information themselves. So almost like flipping the script in that way. The second one is micro supports, and those are intentional communications that provide feedback and scaffold resources with the intention of supporting an individual who may be feeling unwelcome or invisible. And the way you can express that is by actively and purposely expressing interest and intention, and even just providing those resources to someone. That's a way to support them in a small way. That can be as simple as knowing a student who, even going back to Monday session, where if you hear a student maybe has some financial issues, guiding them toward the bridge to benefits, doing that type of counseling, finding ways for the student to better succeed, and even recognizing that there is that inequity and inequality and being like, I recognize that, and here's a way to help break down that barrier. The third one that they talk about are micro validations. And those are communications that appreciate the experience, thoughts, abilities, feelings, an individual who may feel unwelcome. That's just being verbally affirming of different people's opinions, emotions, and beliefs. It can be as simple as using the phrase, well, I believe you, when someone is expressing like, oh, I'm very stressed because of this. It's like, okay, I believe you, and you're not making it up, those types of things. So with all of that, overall, so what are things we in the profession or working with students can alleviate stresses and eliminate barriers for first generation college students? Providing information and resources right away to first generation college students. A really effective way of doing so, I think we're doing at MSU, is having like break-off sessions for first generation students at orientations, or when students apply, having it on the application process of figuring out who is a first generation college student, not only having that list, but then sending out an email at the beginning of the semester with a little bit more in-depth information, or just providing all of that information to all students, because even continuing generation students might have a gap in knowledge or something like that. So orientation is a really prime example of something like that. Something we can do just even in the day-to-day is having a place and being the person for students to be able to express what is stressing and straining them, having an open mind and allowing them to process it. Again, with that micro affirming of like, I believe you, because going back to that one experience I shared of the professor whose doctoral advisor had been like, well, just have your parents pay that for you. What would that mean if they wanted to go to you and be like, yeah, this happened to me and I'm really stressed out about it? Just affirming that, yes, that's a microaggression. Yes, I see that that's happening. Here's some resources, etc., like that. Having more opportunities in programming, in curriculum and things like that for students to be able to develop their identity in a safe way. One of the articles I read by Herman and Varnum actually explored using bicultural models for people to do so, but instead of focusing on things like racial and ethnic identity, using them as a way to talk about living in two cultures especially when talking about social class. So someone who's working class in a middle class environment, how can we implement bicultural models to instead fit that? So that's one way to enter that. Overall, just kind of emphasizing traits like resiliency, persistence, and then a way to find harmony and compatibility between the cultures, rather than being like, these are the differences, these are the deficiencies that first generation college students have, focusing more on what are you bringing to the table that benefits us and how can we better benefit you. And then lastly, for administrators, just providing different professional development programs that target faculty and staff knowledge of the complex issues that first generation students may be dealing with. Just having that very specific and intentional target of like, first generation college students may have more financial issues, may not know that this is the deadline to do this, may not know that you can withdraw from a class and not negatively affect your GPA. So just having that information to be able to pass down to students is important. So that's what I have prepared. So for this portion, the floor is open. So if people have thoughts, questions, anything of that sort, feel free to jump in.
I wonder if anyone has any like specific resources for first generation students. For me, like working in residential life, something we wanted to do was like a first generation like programming event. And then it ended up falling flat and we never actually did it. We did put up like a passive bulletin board about here's our first generation staff members. But even then, first gen students didn't necessarily know that they were first generation college students. So maybe if anyone has any resources specifically, that might be helpful to me.
One of the things I just want to put a plug in for, I actually sat on a committee that was geared towards helping our first generation students. And so there's a Facebook page, it's called Maverick First at mnsu.edu. And that's maintained and run by other members of the committee, both faculty and staff who are invested in helping our first generation students on our campus specifically. And so that's a really great resource. I know that committee does First Fridays, so they do an event every first Friday of every month for first generation students to help build that community. There's also been work done for orientation and during the first year experience courses to really help students understand what it means to be first gen and how to find support and resources. And I know at orientation, we had a breakout session for parents and families and students that were first generation too. So we tried to get them connected right away as they're starting their school experience with us as a first generation student. But I know that website and that Facebook page has a record of posting a lot of information to help everyone with resources for first gen students. So
Thanks, Megan. I appreciate that. That's helpful. I'll check that out.
A couple things that came to mind from both of you. One, like Tamara mentioned, a lot of people just don't know that they're first generation or that there's a difference for first generation students. And so I think having that type of reach out immediately when someone enters the institution who is first generation, like if it's on the application process or in their demographic data or something like that, that way they know from the get-go, oh, I might have these types of barriers, or this might be something that I should think more about, can help alleviate part of that. And then also the parents and family part. One of the issues that was raised earlier in the presentation that have been talked about is that lack of familial support, because students just don't know, or families just don't know how to help their students. And so having those sessions where families can actually come to orientation or the open house, be like, oh, I know that my child is going to be experiencing this, maybe even just being explicit of like, these are ways you can help your child, even if you don't know how to help them with schoolwork. Maybe you don't know how to help them choose a major, but these are ways you can still be as helpful as possible. So rather than keep in stock the difference between independence and interdependence, actually make efforts to cultivate that interdependent relationship. Well, if no one has anything else to share, that's what I had prepared.